So I do want to take a little moment and introduce Kristin Eberhard. She, some of her background, right? She graduated with honors from Stanford. She graduated cum laude from Duke University School of Law, and she is a lawyer. And she also got a master's in engineering management, or a master's in environmental management from Duke's School of the Environment, Nicholas School of the Environment, right? So Kristin's career has been focused on environmental policy, right? She's a she's a proud policy wonk, right? She likes getting into the details, and that's what I certainly appreciate about her. But she also has a good way of communicating these details. So she's been in environmental reform stuff, and then more recently, she's worked with Sightline Institute. She's one of their team at Sightline Institute. They work on environmental reform, but my understanding is from talking to Sightline, they begin to realize that if you want environmental change, policy change in this country, you first have to learn how to deal with the politics and some of the fundamental structures of how some of them are broken. And so Sightline has this offshoot of their organization that's working on democracy reform. And that's really what we're focused on here today, right? So Kristin Eberhard, you can take it away.
All right, thank you for that. And thanks everyone for being here today to talk about my new book, Becoming a Democracy, How We Can Fix the Electoral College Gerrymandering and Our Elections. The book looks at 10 proven solutions that we can do right now. No constitutional amendment needed, no change in the courts needed, and most of these can be implemented at the state level. You don't even necessarily need Congress. And indeed, many of the solutions in the book are things that are already being implemented here in the Pacific Northwest, and we're sort of hoping to export our success elsewhere. But that said, the things we'll talk about today are things that we could still do. So the book lays out these problems that were designed into our system, into the way that our democratic institutions work, from low voter turnout to big money to unequal representation. But the main thrust of the book is to describe solutions and hopefully get readers involved in spreading those solutions to their local and state jurisdictions and across the country. So the book is designed so you can just pick it up and read it cover to cover and sort of get the full history of context, or you can flip just straight to the chapter of the issue that you care about the most and just go deep onto that one. So tonight I'm going to focus on the solutions that are related to ensuring equal representation. So that's ranked choice voting, proportional representation, the Electoral College, and the Senate. So this year, this election, we had record turnout. We had over 150 million Americans vote, including more than 100 million who voted early or by mail. So this was fantastic. It was very high participation for the United States. But now that we got those people to come out and vote and, get registered, turn in their ballot, jump through all the hoops that we put in front of them, now the question is, does it matter? How well did their vote actually translate into equal representation for everyone who voted? How well do they feel like now somebody is representing them in government and that those someones are accountable back to voters? And those are all questions that have to do with the way that our system translates votes into representation differently for different people. And there are some solutions to make sure that everybody has equal representation. So the first one we'll talk about is ranked choice voting, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But for many elections in the United States, I know not in Washington where there's top two, but in other places, often there's a primary that selects a candidate from each of the major parties. But because only the most partisan voters are participating in that primary, those primaries often select the most extreme candidates from each party. And then in the general election, voters come out and they only see that more extreme candidate who's made it through the party primary. And so even if they maybe found the person to be too extreme, So ranked choice voting lets voters rank candidates in order of preference. And by using that, really lower voter participation than other races even lower down on the ballot, suggesting that when people see there's only two candidates from one party, they just skip that line and move on because they don't feel like they really have options. So ranked choice voting would allow you to have no primary or like 5 primary, so that have to worry about any of those options being ranked choice voting is being used already across the country, and it has other, limiting the spoiler effect is sort of the big one that a lot of people think of, but it has these other benefits like tamping down negative campaigns. And it has been building a lot of momentum. So a big win for ranked choice voting was in Alaska. This year, Measure 2 passed. Alaskans said yes to having a open top 4 primary and then a ranked choice general election for governor, their state legislators, their US Congress, and the president. So in 2024, Alaska and Maine will use ranked choice voting for their presidential elections. And the effects of ranked choice voting are maybe already showing up. So Lisa Murkowski, because Measure 2 passed, she no longer has to worry about being primaried in a Republican primary by a more extreme Republican, a Trump Republican. Instead, as she's looking at her reelection, she's now looking at a ranked election where she needs to win support from a majority of Alaskans. And so she is sort of free from these more extreme primary voters and very accountable now to the majority of Alaskans. And the result is that she has been more strident than other Republicans have been in saying that she it doesn't approve of inciting violence against the Capitol, and that if that's what the Republican Party is for, then she doesn't necessarily consider herself a Republican. So we could see this possibly that kind of a change in behavior and a change in incentives, or a change in who gets elected across the country with more ranked choice voting. And ranked choice voting gathered momentum in cities too. So in particular, Albany, California passed multi-winner ranked choice voting, which we'll talk about next. And several other cities passed single winner ranked choice voting for their mayor and city council races. Okay, so the next thing that we can talk about, which is what Albany passed, ranked choice voting is one way of getting there, but the idea is proportional representation, which is to say that if 10% of voters vote for a Green Party candidate, 10% of the representatives will be Green Party. 40% vote Democrat, then 40% of representatives will be Democrats. In other words, that the legislature, your lawmakers, will sort of match the makeup of your voters. So this is actually what some of the founding fathers actually really believed in proportional representation. They just didn't have the systems for getting it yet developed in the 18th century. So George Washington warned against two-party rule, saying that it would lead to bad things because each party would, try and get back at the other. And he was right. We can see that playing out now, but he didn't even know the half of it, right? So it's not just that it creates this, sniping back and forth of the two parties. It creates gridlock where the parties now are sort of locked into their positions and they can't work together even for things that their voters might want. And that alienates voters. So, that we have lower voter turnout. And then what we've seen is it started even alienating voters against democracy itself. We see a rising number of Americans who are not so sure that they even want democracy. And then, of course, it allows minority rule because of gerrymandering, allowing a certain party to win control, even though they didn't win the most votes. So what we see is other countries, almost all other developed countries who have, created a system or written a constitution later than the United States, use some form of proportional representation, and they see higher turnout. So you can see here the orange countries are, for the most part, the UK and former colonies who still use single winner districts. All these other countries use some kind of proportional representation, and they enjoy higher voter participation. And one of the things that I have found most striking is that voters in proportional representation countries, even if their favorite candidate or their favorite party didn't win, they are more likely to accept the results and say, like, yeah, my party didn't win because they didn't have enough support, and that's how the system works. Whereas in single winner district countries like the United States, people are more likely to sort of to question the results or feel bitter about the results if their party didn't win. And we can really see the results of that to the extreme in this election. So the thing that really allows for gerrymandering is single winner districts. You probably have all heard about gerrymandering, where the politicians sort of draw the lines in a certain way so that they have an advantage in the results. Some people say it's politicians choosing their voters rather than voters choosing their politicians. And that whole game is enabled by single winner districts. You really can't do that kind of gerrymandering with any form of proportional representation. So proportional representation leads to a multi-party system, whereas the way that we vote in single winner districts leads to a two-party system. And this matrix is using data from Pew Charitable Trusts, and sort of they have a political typology where they group people into different groups. And then I mapped them according to their answers on certain questions as being more changing cultural values, like if they value diversity and are pro-choice, or more traditional cultural values, and then more pro-business versus regulating business. And you can see there's, we sort of follow along a diagonal, but there's a fair amount of diversity. And just having two parties with two big tents that are essentially like just the top right corner or just the bottom left corner leaves out a lot of voters, and it leaves out a lot of viewpoints. And what we've had for many years is these two big tent parties are kind of just swallowing up all of those different viewpoints and kind of tamping them down within one big tent. And that for a while kind of worked when there was more cross-pollination between those two big tents. But now, as those tents have really pulled apart from each other, what we're seeing is that it's very hard to get anything done because they're both sort of blocking the other's agenda. And if we were able to have a multi-party system where you had, a business conservative and a Trump conservative, and a, AOC wing of the party and a Joe Biden wing of the Democratic Party, there would be more fluidity for those to work together. And what we've seen in other proportional representation countries, it might take a little more negotiation to get something passed because you've got to work through those coalitions. But once it passes, it's very durable because it had enough buy-in from enough different people that it's not just like somebody else gets in power and they go and overturn it, because there's not a big enough opposition to overturn anything. So they take a little longer to formulate their policies, but then those policies really stay in place and they don't spend all their energy just tearing down what somebody else put in place. So to get to this proportional representation system, there's different ways of getting there. One way is to use a ranked ballot, like I talked about in the previous chapter, but use it in a multi-winner district. Another way is what we call mixed member proportional, which is to say you still have a single winner district, so you can have your local rep and you vote for your favorite person for the local rep, but then you have a vote for your favorite party. and those parties get seats proportionally, so that it's a mixed body where some of them are taken from a party list and some of them are from your local district. But overall, it ends up being more proportional than what we have. And the reason that I think this is kind of, there's other options, there's other ways to get there, but this one is interesting because it's what New Zealand did. So New Zealand, being a former British colony like us, used to have single winner districts, and they had two main parties, and they had election results where a party would win control even though they didn't win the most votes, just like us. And they got sick of it in the 1990s, and they decided to make a change. And this is the system that they changed to. And it was a really dramatic difference. So they went from looking just like us, they sort of, you know, it was all blue and red, to having more diversity. You still have two sort of like, you know, center left and a center right party, but you have a little more diversity around the edges. And they immediately, so that you could see that the change happened after the 1993 election. And this is Maori people, who are the native peoples of New Zealand, and their percentage representation jumped overnight. Women's representation jumped up and stayed up. You can see now New Zealand has a very successful young female prime minister. So if New Zealand did this in the 90s, it seems like a promising potential for the United States to maybe be able to make a similar kind of change. Okay, so let's talk about the Electoral College. This is probably on our minds these days with everything that's gone down. And probably many of us are very aware that in two of the six most recent elections, the candidate who won more votes lost the presidency. So that has huge implications. It's not just like, oh, this feels unfair, but it matters a lot, not only for what bills can get passed, but which federal judges get confirmed, how much people trust in their democracy, how they feel about their vote mattering and their vote actually doing something to elect someone. So this is, I mean, it's hard to think about how we as Americans can hold our heads up and say, hey, you know, we're the oldest functioning democracy in the world, when the loser wins a third of the time in our most important election. So how do we convince people that, you know, our democracy is working and they should go out and vote when it feels like it doesn't translate into actual power? So the good news is, the Constitution does not say it needs to work this way. The Constitution does not set up this system, not at all. The Constitution gives each state a certain number of electors, and then it says it's completely up to the states what to do with their electoral votes. So over time, most states have changed. So some of them did it proportionally, some of them did it by district, some of them had a mixed system, and then over time, most states changed to what they mostly use now, which is a state winner-take-all system, where they give all of their electoral votes to one winner of the state popular vote. So they changed, they decided to do it that way, and they can change and decide it to do a different way. So each state could decide to give its electoral votes to the candidate who wins the most votes in the country. And then the one who wins the most votes would always win. So if states controlling at least 270 electoral votes sign on to a compact, it's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, then the candidate who wins the most votes would always win the presidency. And so far, states controlling 196 of the Electoral College votes have signed on. So each hex in this map represents one electoral vote, so you can sort of see you know, how much weight each state has. And the darkest ones are already signed on to the compact. The light green ones have passed it through at least one house. In some cases, they passed it through two houses, and then the governor refused to sign it, but they've all passed it through at least one house. So if all of the places that have passed it through one house managed to pass it through both and get it signed, the compact would have enough votes and would take effect. So you will probably notice, though, as you look at this map, that most of the states that have already signed on are blue states, where Biden won most of them by a landslide. And some Republicans have, become convinced that Republican candidates can't win the popular vote. So they have to keep this state winner take all system in order to have a shot at the presidency. And this makes it sometimes hard for red states to sign on because the state legislators there feel loyalty to their party and feel like this would be disadvantageous to the Republican Party. But there are Republicans campaigning for the compact because they think that the Republican Party can have broad appeal, just like the days of Reagan, and because they're tired of red safe states being ignored. So we probably all know the unfairness of the Electoral College. One electoral vote in Wyoming represents 190,000 people, but one electoral vote in Texas represents 760,000 people, so 4 times as much. It seems pretty unfair on its face, and the possibly the founders' best argument for the Electoral College was that basically it would defend us against Trump, right? That people who maybe had some way of pandering to people and having popular support, even though they maybe didn't have the ability to carry through on it, that the Electoral College would sort of see through that. They would be wise people who would see through it and would stop that from happening. But that has not played out. Another argument for the Electoral College that I hear is that it's really important for small states to have more power, and the Electoral College gives them some power in the presidential election. But the interesting thing is the 10 smallest states are actually split evenly between Democrats and Republicans. So it's hard to say exactly what the Electoral College should be doing for the small state block when there isn't a small state block. They're literally completely evenly split. And in practice, what happens is that all 10 of those small states are safe states. So they don't actually get any attention in the presidential campaign. They don't get campaign visits. They don't get, pork barreled money after the fact because they're safe. So that idea that somehow you're giving something to small states doesn't really play out. So in fact, the states that are really benefiting from the Electoral College, who are getting all of the campaign visits, who are getting the attention, and who are getting the money from the executive branch afterward, these are the 10 swing states. And they're all pretty big. I mean, Nevada is the smallest, and it's not really a tiny state, and most of them are in the 10 largest states. So the practical effect of the Electoral College is actually to help big battleground states, not to help small states. So another argument that I hear is that you have to sort of appeal to a lot of states. You can't just win in just California or just New York. But the truth is, actually, you could, technically win 270 electoral votes by campaigning in just 11 states, just the biggest 11 states. You could ignore all the rest. So, I mean, as it happens, the biggest states go different ways, but just numerically, that argument doesn't really hold up. And so the final argument that I hear is the Electoral College forces candidates to appeal across the country. They can't just win in a single region. They've really got to spread it around and think about the whole country. And again, you could easily win in a landslide without ever stepping foot east of the Mississippi. And this is, like I said, a landslide. You could even take out pretty much all of New England and really just campaign in sort of Appalachia and the Great Lakes. So I haven't found any of the arguments for the Electoral College to be convincing, and really just making every count vote would make every vote count. So candidates, if they had to win every vote, if they had to win the popular vote, they would campaign across the country, not just in big battleground states. They would go everywhere that they could win a voter. So national popular vote interstate compact could make this happen without an amendment to the Constitution. Oh, sorry. One more thing that I hear is that cities would dominate, that candidates could just win in the cities. But it turns out we actually don't really have enough cities. The 100 biggest cities are like 20% of the population. So if you had to win over the most votes, campaigning in cities would not be a winning path. All right, let's talk about the Senate. So the Senate is actually, I actually went back and forth on whether to include a Senate chapter in the book. The Senate is probably the biggest problem in American democracy right now, and also the hardest to solve. And I was trying to have the book be things that were sort of road tested, proven, that we could adopt right now. And there's not a really obvious, great solution to the Senate that is road tested. But I did end up including the chapter because there is a solution. It has happened on a small scale before. It's possible, and the Senate is just such a huge problem that we have to try and do something. So the Senate was a pretty big compromise at the Constitutional Convention. There were many of the founding fathers who we know, Hamilton, Madison, Washington, they did not like the idea of having basically some people have more representation than others. But the smaller states threatened to walk away, threatened to basically go ally themselves with some foreign power if they did not get equal representation in the Senate. So it was a compromise, but Hamilton actually really thought the compromise would not stand. He couldn't imagine how big states would continue to give away so much power, would continue to have so much less representation per person than the smaller states. He thought they would revolt and that it wouldn't stand. But it has. And not only has it stood, it's gotten so much worse. So at the founding, the biggest colony was 13 times as large as the smallest colony. So that was, a pretty big disparity in representation. Now the biggest state is 70 times as big as the smallest state. So we now have a huge disparity in representation, and it's getting worse because the big states are growing and the small states are not. So this is only getting worse. So the result is that depending on where you live, you have very different amount of representation because 2 states have 4 senators, but the same amount of people as 23 other states. So your voice in our federal government is just a complete random depending on what state you happen to live in. And it's not, unfortunately, the bias of the Senate is not random. So because those bigger states, they are growing by being more diverse and more metropolitan, right? As the places that people are moving to is California, Texas, New York, Florida. And so they are more racially diverse, younger, more urban dwellers, whereas the smallest states are more rural because there's not as many people moving there. So they're more white, more rural, more conservative, are getting a systematically bigger voice in our federal government. So Hamilton, again, he really hated the Senate, and he thought, the Senate could lead to minority rule, right? That senators representing a minority of Americans could have a majority of votes in the Senate, and that would lead to all these problems, delays, inaction. And he said contemptible compromises of the public good. And how right he was. From the beginning, the Senate blocked 8 bills that the House had passed that would have limited or abolished slavery. The Senate blocked House-passed bills on civil rights for years and years. It has blocked bills on climate change. It has blocked now H.R. 1, a great democracy reform package that the House passed and the Senate would not pass it. So Hamilton's worst fears are indeed playing out. So what do we do? So the problem at the heart of the Senate is that it represents states, not people. And we now have a democracy where we expect that people should get representation. So unfortunately, that aspect of the Senate, that it represents states and that each state has to have its equal representation, is embedded really deeply in the Constitution. So if we're trying to fix this without changing the Constitution, we need to just make the states have less of a disparity in population, not have that 70-to-1 disparity. So if we were, say, just to go back to the initial disparity, that 13-to-1, where the biggest state was no more than 13 times the smallest, that would mean no state could be more than 7 million people each. And there are right now 13 states that are more than 7 million. So if we said we're going to break those states up into states that are no more than 7 million each, here is one way we might do this. So this is taking the states and trying to group together, kind of follow geographic boundaries, existing county and city lines. And then I colored them according to their 2016 presidential election results to see how many sort of blue, safe blue, safe red, and purplish states there would be. And we would add roughly an equal number of red and blue states and quite a few purple states, which would be interesting. So I know that this looks at, there have been many, many attempts to break up California actually over the years, including a recent ballot initiative, and that Californians, it sort of feels like, well, we're big and we could sort of throw our weight around. And so if we broke ourselves up into smaller states, wouldn't that just make us less powerful, less effective? And so I think an interesting thing to think about of how we could maybe address that concern is that these states could maintain interstate compacts to maintain some of the sort of oversight the bigger state had, and maybe even extend that to other states. So California right now, they have the Air Resources Board, which oversees their, fairly aggressive climate actions. So the Air Resources Board could continue to be the state agency for all of these new smaller states. And in fact, maybe it would then create a precedent where Oregon or some of the new Washington states would join and be part of that regulatory framework under the California Air Resources Board. It would become the Western Air Resources Board for addressing climate change. So I think that I know that this is the most far-fetched of my ideas, but it's possible. You don't have to have an amendment to break up states. You just have to have the state legislature and Congress vote for it. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a partisan thing, because it sort of creates a new and not necessarily skewed in either way partisan dynamic. And it could open up sort of interesting possibilities for more regional cooperation and action. So in conclusion, there's just so much we have to do right now. We've got a global pandemic, we've got climate change, inequality, and to do all of these things, we have to have democracy. We have to have functioning institutions of governments. And so we're right now in this not great place where many of our systems in the US here were not actually designed to make sure that everyone has equal representation. And we are really feeling the problems from that right now. But the good news is we have solutions at hand, solutions that many of which are already being implemented in cities or states across the country, and we can spread them elsewhere. So we need to adopt these solutions so that we can make the United States actually a democracy that is ready to handle the 21st century. And I look forward to your questions. And I hope that if you do check out the book, you can get it on Amazon or BookBaby. It's actually a print on demand shop, BookBaby. And that if you do like it and read it, I hope you would leave a review on Amazon so that other people can find it.
Thank you, Kristin. This is Suzanne. We do have a question from Chris asking about gerrymandering. He says, a lot of groups promote ending gerrymandering, but most of them only talk about independent redistricting. What are your thoughts on what it will take to get groups like Represent Us and Indivisible to embrace multi-member districts as the best solution to gerrymandering.
Yeah, this is definitely a frustration of mine, is that a lot of good governance groups see independent redistricting as the solution. And it is a solution to, sorry, my cat is very interested in democracy. And while those independent commissions do help solve sort of the most egregious political gerrymandering, where you had one party that was in charge and was just, like in Maryland and in North Carolina, just like very blatantly, purposefully trying to get themselves more seats. Unfortunately, that's not all that's happening. So because of the way voters are now distributed, that in general, Democratic voters tend to live in urban areas, and rural areas tend to be actually somewhat evenly split. I mean, they slightly lean Republican, but they're actually evenly split, whereas urban areas are very, very heavily Democratic. So even with an independent commission, or even if you draw the districts to look very nice and compact, that system is biased against urban dwellers. So it will always elect disproportionately more conservatives than voters were voting for conservatives. So we could get independent districting commissions across the country, and it would be an improvement. It would be better than what we have now, but it would still result in some people not having as much power to translate their vote into actual representation as other people. And the only way to do that is through proportional representation. So that's my speech on why it's annoying. But in terms of how to get those groups on board, so Represent Us, we work with Represent Us, and they are very aware of proportional representation. They know how powerful it is, but they're also very pragmatic. And so they are looking at the solutions that are, that they can have a win on. And so I think that if they start to see the tide changing where they feel like proportional representation could be a winning prospect, they will shift their resources into it. It's just they're not seeing it now. And in terms of Indivisible, I actually think Indivisible, so Represent Us is very studiously bipartisan, whereas Indivisible is more, they're for Democrats. And so I actually think that the argument to Indivisible is stronger, because if they want Democrats to get elected, independent districting commissions ultimately are still going to be biased against them just because of where people live. So if they want a fair shot for Democratic candidates, they should want proportional representation.
Thank you, Kristin. We have another question from Joan Reinerson. Joan's asking, she says, Schumer has announced H.R. 1 will be the first bill he introduces. It's passed the House. With the new Senate configuration, does it have a chance of passing there?
I'm sorry, my internet cut out for a second. So is this about...
Let me repeat that for you, Kristin. Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah. So this is from Joan, and she's saying Schumer has announced that H.R. 1 will be the first bill he introduces. It's passed the House. With the new Senate configuration, does it have a chance of passing there?
No. I'm sorry. But even though the Democrats have 51 votes in the Senate, they actually can't pass anything controversial unless they have 60 votes, because they have to get past the filibuster. So until Democrats are willing to reform, get rid of, eat away at the filibuster, they will not be able to pass things like H.R. 1.
Can I ask, Kristin, this is Suzanne asking this on my own, but what opinions do you have about the filibuster, and, could it possibly, go away, and what would be your feelings, pro and con, about that, if you want to share them?
Yeah, we desperately need the filibuster to go away. And so far, not enough Democrats agree with me to make that happen. But my most hopeful path that I see is that the Democrats come out guns blazing. I mean, Biden has said he has a very ambitious 100-day agenda. and that they will come out and pass all of these really important reforms through the House, and that all of those will die in the Senate. And that at some point, Democrats will realize we are not going to be able to deliver on any of our promises until we reform the filibuster. And when they realize that and realize that they're going to have to go back to their voters in 2022 and they're going to get, killed for not having done anything, that maybe that will become more important than, whatever ideas they have about the sort of, noble nature of the filibuster, which are not true.
It just seems a vehicle for obstruction from my point of view, but you know better. Okay, thank you for that. We have another question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Just while we're still on the filibuster discussion, Tom asked, and I'm curious too. I don't know, like, what does it even take to get rid of that filibuster? Is it can the current Senate do that? Do they have that voting power?
They can, yeah. So it's a Senate rule. They can change the rule. And they've done it in the past. The filibuster used to apply to federal judge confirmations, and the Republicans made a carve out in 2013, I think, for Neil Gorsuch, which now holds. So Democrats could do the same thing. They could just make carve outs, right? Like the filibuster doesn't apply to bills about democracy. The filibuster doesn't apply to bills about pandemics. So they can just make those carve outs, or they can just change the rule completely or they can also lower the vote threshold, right? It used to be 67. A simple majority vote rule lowered it to 60. They could lower it again. So there's a couple of options for either get rid of it completely or just or making it a little less destructive.
Yeah. Personally, I like the carve-out idea, because I like the idea of the filibuster when it comes to a lot and lots of different laws. You should have a really overwhelming agreement on certain things. Of course, it doesn't help that it's in the Senate, where it's not a democratically or personally elected group anyway, so that's already a problem. But there are certainly some parts of government and some laws that just need to be decided 50-50, right? There's no other way to do it. And those are things that govern how do we even run ourselves, right? Who are we putting into this office, appointments and these rules about how our election's done, right? These are the kinds of things where it has to be decided one way or the other. So no filibuster makes sense, right? Just let these thin thresholds decide things. Okay.
All right, we've got another question from Jeff. He asked, says, I have a question about breaking up the states. I know that doesn't require a constitutional amendment, but wouldn't that almost be easier than a legislator abdicating their power to a new separate entity?
Easier than a legislator abdicating their power to a new separate entity? What? I'm sorry.
He's comparing the difference between having a constitutional amendment to just change the way the Senate is created versus breaking up states where currently existing legislatures have to just abdicate their power to these other states that don't even exist yet. So.
Oh, that from a legislator's point of view, in terms of their power, that like a constitutional convention might be a better bet than breaking up states. Maybe. Nobody knows what will come out of a constitutional convention, and so it's a pretty big risk.
So one, that's kind of a myth, but that's a different topic. What I mean is to say, so in Washington State, they continue, again, they introduced the Liberty Bill, where they would be breaking Washington into Eastern Washington and Western Washington, and Eastern Washington would be called Liberty. But one, that's only proposed by a right-wing, section of the legislature, and everybody laughs at them for it every year they introduce it. Mm-hmm. So the lift of amending the Constitution, either way, there's two ways to do it. Seems almost easier than trying to convince the state legislature to just you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. No, I acknowledge this is a ridiculously huge lift. One way that I envision, I mean, again, not a likely way, but a possible thing that could happen would be bilateral disarmament, right? That you would pass a law that says states are no longer allowed to be more than 13 times the smallest state. And so every big state would sort of have to redraw their boundaries all at the same time. So it wouldn't be, in the case of Washington splitting up into 2 states, that would essentially just add 2 Republican senators to the Senate, right? And so no, of course, Democrats are never going to agree to that. Whereas if you agree to break up all 13 large states all at the same time, that actually doesn't necessarily go one way or the other. And there's possible considerations on both sides. Republicans generally like smaller states that are sort of closer to the people. So maybe it's attractive to them that you don't have these huge mega states. And Democrats, like I said, maybe there's some opening up of interstate compacts, and then just overall, it's probably generally better for Democrats to have more Democratic representation. So maybe there's some way that there is a grand compromise on that. But yes, this is not in the Overton window at the moment. It's a thing that it's an idea I'm throwing out that maybe who knows? We had a global pandemic, we had rioters attacking the Capitol. I don't know what's going to happen in 2021. Maybe something would change that would make it possible. It's not like it's going to happen right now.
Since you just mentioned the pandemic, that is a question that came up in the chat room about, how does that affect our ability to do these kind of changes?
Yeah.
I mean, even in Washington State, where we had the initiative process, it's much harder to go out and get signatures in this.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that affects, because many of these, changing the rules of democracy often is going to have to be done by ballot initiative, because the people who won by the rules aren't going to be the ones to initiate changes to the rules. And yeah, right now it's hard to get those ballot initiatives, but hopefully maybe 2022, the 2022 ballot, we will actually be able to gather signatures.
Okay, next one, I've got a question from James, excuse me. I'm sorry, I'm not reading that. Jamin Mason. So how do we as Washingtonians make this back of the bus way of thinking go away? If I didn't read that correctly, go ahead and unmic yourself and present. Does that make any sense, Kristin? Did you
make this?
So excuse me. I was just saying the old way of back of the bus way of thinking, this is slavery talk pretty much, or things that got appointed in the days of slavery. Mm-hmm. How do we as Washingtonians make this happen, ranked choice voting happen quicker?
Yeah. So I think the first thing probably many of you are aware is the local options bill. So often the way that ranked choice voting spreads is you do it at the local level. So in Maine, they had ranked choice voting in Portland, Maine for many years, and then they adopted it statewide in Maine. So in Washington, localities are right now not allowed to adopt ranked choice voting. So the first step is just changing state law to allow them, so that we can at least then have some experimentation at the local level. So Fairvote Washington has introduced for a couple of years the local options bill to just let cities do it if they want to. So that's kind of the first step.
And I'll just jump in here. Joan asked for an update on what's happening with the ranked choice voting legislation in Washington State's House. The local options bill has been introduced this legislative session. We have a prime sponsor and 26 co-sponsors. It has bipartisan support. We are working very hard to mobilize our volunteers and make sure that our representatives know that we are for this bill. I will go ahead and put in the chat box. It's incredibly easy to just go online and register your support for the bill. You just hit comment on the bill, you fill in your address, you tick off your representatives that it automatically adds, and you can register your support for the bill. So I will put that in the chat box, but know that there is a bill. It is working on being passed. It's in committee right now. We have a lot of confidence that it's going to make it through this year. So your help would be very appreciated. Please take a look at the link I'll post in a minute in the chat box.
Thanks, Jesse. Okay, we have another question from Marie Campanoli. She's asking, could larger states possibly have more senators? What do you think, Kristin?
Unfortunately, no. That is, the Constitution says that each state has to have its equal representation. So that's part of what makes the Senate such a big problem, is that it's built into the Constitution. And it's interesting because, you know, many states actually had a sort of a Senate-like, or, you know, a Senate based on the US Senate for their state Senate, where each county had equal representation, no matter how many people were in the county. And the Supreme Court struck that down in the 60s, saying it violated the principle of one person, one vote. And so all these states had to like rethink their senates, and now the House and the Senate is completely duplicative. They're just like the same, representing the same people, but doing the same thing twice. But that Supreme Court decision, of course, was not able to strike down the US Senate, which is blatantly violating one person, one vote, but it's built into the Constitution.
In fact, you know, and it's even more of a lift than any other amendment to the Constitution. The proportionality in the Senate, like every single state having exactly 2 senators, like that is the one caveat in the Constitution that if we were to ever have a constitutional amendment, it would require absolutely every single state to agree, right? Whereas normally you have a constitutional amendment, you only have to get 3/4 of the states to agree on those amendments. But yeah, so it's even more of a heavy lift. Realistically, splitting up states is far more realistic. Another option, of course, which not a great one, but we could just totally start over and create a new constitution, and in some sense a new country. But that's a pretty radical idea itself.
Actually, that poses a question, Data, that I was thinking about, because Kristin, one of the things that I've learned in past political involvement is, and came to me as complete news, was that, of course, other than our amendments, the U.S. really hasn't, unlike many other countries, sort of just held a constitutional convention, say, every 10 or 20 years and said, let's take a look at this and let's update it. Is that anything that you think could ever happen? Is that worthwhile to happen? Or are we just too ingrained with what we have and it's immovable?
Yeah, I mean, so the US Constitution is the hardest to amend in the world. And, you know, interestingly, Thomas Jefferson actually thought that constitutions should be, you know, reviewed and considered and revised every 20 years. And yet, you know, he wasn't at the convention, but he was kind of part of the cohort that founded a constitution that's almost impossible to change. So yes, if you're going to have a living document, like there needs to be some mechanism for it to adjust with the times, and we don't have that right now. So if we were to start over, we should definitely build that in.
Okay.
Sorry,
go ahead, Jesse.
Sorry, I've got a question here from Dustin. Asking, are we not gathering signatures now or brainstorming ways to accomplish that? And I'm not sure if Dustin wrote that before or after he learned about the local options bill. Dustin, do you want to unmute yourself and just elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, the question was for generally everywhere throughout the United States. I mean, we have no idea how long this pandemic is going to last. There's always people who are optimists saying, oh, it's, you know, just a few more months. And then data is coming in saying, oh, just kidding. The vaccines might not be all that effective against the new strains that are becoming dominant. So, you know, I think we should consider a strategy for the long term and finding ways to work around this obstacle. And if it is in the law that we have to obtain physical signatures, I think we could consider other ways, like having people print out the signature pages themselves and circulate it amongst their family members, and then I don't know, find a way to discount postage and have them mail it to us. Just
yeah, it's an
ideas.
Excellent question. And something I've learned since becoming very involved with Fairvote is that all the states do it differently. So there are some states that successfully have ballot gathering or signature gathering initiatives for the 2020 ballot, or for this year, where their states have allowed them to do it digitally. I do not know if Washington State allows us to gather digital signatures. I do know that we have made the decision not to pursue any signature gathering campaigns this year. We were considering doing signature gathering this summer for to be on the 2021 ballot, and there are a couple charter counties that even without the local options bill could choose to adopt ranked choice voting because of wonky rules. We're choosing not to do that and to appeal directly to the Charter Commission. We are gearing up for a signature gathering campaign in 2022. So next spring is when that would kick off. This is a huge thing that we're gathering volunteers for, to be able to mobilize about a year from today, a massive signature gathering campaign. And we will need about 300,000 signatures because we had record turnout for our last election, and it's based on a percentage of who voted in the last election. And so we are getting momentum for that. That is going to happen. And the goal for that ballot initiative, even if the local options bill passes, we will still do this to have our federal and state offices be elected through ranked choice voting, much like what Alaska has passed and what Maine does, because that's a thing that is not going to happen this year through the legislature. So good question. And yeah, happy to answer. Data.
No, sorry, Jesse, much like you, I'm not sure about the citizens initiative process right now, but I do know that other petition initiative processes in Washington State have been allowed to be done differently. We had to get petition gathering to put people on the ballot for president and for governor and things like that. And that can be done not completely digitally, but you send the form, you email the form, and then individual people print it out and mail it, right? So there was some workaround allowed in 2020 in that way.
Since we have a lull in questions, I'll just interject with a quick plug for Fairvote. If you are interested in ranked choice voting and you would like to learn more, we do have about every 10 days a ranked choice voting 101 seminar. It gives you a great idea of what Fairvote is doing and what you can do to help. And of course, attending your local chapter meetings is a great way to get involved and make sure that you're always up to date on what we need. So if anyone has more questions.
Yeah. If anybody does have more questions, we can entertain a few more. If not, we can wrap up for the afternoon. Any more questions? I think at this point, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and just go ahead and present them directly to Kristin if we do have more questions. Anybody else?
So,
what? Go ahead, Data.
This group of people interested like mine, right? I've always thought that we have this interstate compact to try and override the Electoral College. It would take a little more gumption from some state, but I think you don't even need the compact. If you just had a state with some 8 or 9 or 10 electoral votes, like if Washington State by itself just said, that's it, we're doing it, right? We don't even need a compact. We're just going to say from now on, Washington State or California or some state is just going to always give their electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. That would be enough to change the game. Because, our last couple elections have come down to within 10 or 20 electoral votes. And so if the candidates know, as soon as the candidates know there are a significant portion of electoral votes available to me based on the national popular vote, they will already have to change the way they campaign. And as soon as candidates change the way they campaign, as soon as the swing states lose the power of being swing states, then they're going to stop fighting, and the Constitution is going to be amended pretty soon, I would think.
Well, you'd have to have a state on each side, right? Because California said, we're going to do this. It wouldn't matter in years when a Democrat won the popular vote, because California.
No, I think it would be easier for a Democratic state to do it, because historically, and every single election where the winner of the national popular vote did not win the Electoral College, it's always been the more progressive candidate that won the national popular vote. And so blue states really have no risk, right? The Electoral College always favors the conservative candidate. If your state is already blue, there's really no risk in just saying we're going to do it, because if the candidate ultimately wasn't going to win your state, they probably weren't going to win the Electoral College anyway. So.
Well, it wouldn't, but blue states, so the Democratic candidate has won the popular vote in 5 of the last 6 elections. So a blue state agreeing to give its electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote wouldn't change anything, because they're already giving their votes to the winner of the popular vote. It would have to be a red state agreeing to give its votes to the winner of the popular vote, because that would actually switch those.
No, I think fundamentally it would change things. And that's what I'm saying. There's no risk to that state, because you were going to give your votes to that person anyway. But it would fundamentally change the way candidates campaign, which is what the whole thing is about, right? The only reason we haven't got rid of the Electoral College at this point is because the swing states enjoy too much power all the time. Swing state senators run DC, right? They have power all the time. And so the only reason that hasn't changed is because they're not willing to give up that power, right? But it's not what needs to change is the way the candidates campaign, right? As soon as they know some significant number of electoral votes are up for grabs based on national campaigning, they will stop campaigning just in the swing states. They will campaign everywhere, right?
Well, I think part of Kristin's point
like
is
the Democrats right now, Democrats don't really campaign heavily in Texas or other really solid red states. The Democratic Party just doesn't bother campaigning there because their votes don't matter. But if California was going to give their votes to whoever won the national popular vote, it would change the way the Democrats would run for office, and that would change the dynamic, I think.
You would also then have to have Californians would have to be okay with being, the only state that's going to give their electoral college votes to a Republican, even though the state voted blue, which, if that actually came into play, would be controversial. Whereas part of what the Interstate Compact does is, because everybody signed on, everybody's sort of taking that leap together and saying, yes, we want the popular winner to win. And even if that means that my state ends up giving its electoral college votes to somebody we didn't vote for, we think that's right because we're part of a movement to elect the right winner. But if you're the only state doing it, there would be a lot more pressure, political pressure when it flipped from your state winner.
Yeah, I think, but my point is, if it ever came that the Republican won the national popular vote, well, they were going to win anyway, right? Because the Electoral College always favors the conservative candidate. So,
although that is true in the last couple decades, but things change. So, like Texas, if Texas became a blue state, then the Electoral College would favor Democrats. So, I mean, you can't, you know,
There's- I
things
think
don't
there's
stay.
power in numbers. Like if
Yeah.
you, as a group, if you come at it as a group, you know, the United States of America, that just has so much power, not just numerically, but psychologically. And that's how you get things changed, is you change the way people think about things. And
Yeah.
so you can't fight 13 states or 15 states. You know, if they have enough votes, they're just going to do it.
Can I ask another question, Kristin? This is going back a little bit to the, the gridlock of the two-party system. If you didn't talk about already, I did miss it if you have, but the one thing that surprised me is how much the founders anticipated the gridlock that a two-party system might create and how against it they were.
Oh, Suzanne, you just muted.
If I had missed that portion because of the staring at the chat, then never mind. But can you talk about that a little if I haven't missed it?
Yeah. So yeah, this is interesting that the founders in, a lot of their discussions, they really anticipated the problems that we're seeing with the two-party system, and they wanted really a proportional system. They didn't know how to get it. And so instead they thought, we'll try and just thwart parties altogether, which obviously never worked. But it is interesting the way in which they were so, like, their main concern was sort of dividing power up so that they didn't end up with a despot like King George. And so they put all this effort into dividing power between the three different branches. And what we see now is that the most important power centers now are parties, not branches, right? So they have these careful checks and balances, but it depends on Congress wanting to defend Congress's power against the president, and and the judiciary wanting to defend the judiciary's power against the president. And now what we've seen is that it's parties that matter, not branches. So if a party is the same, if a congressman is the same party as the president, they are willing to give power to that president because they're giving it to their party. And the founders didn't anticipate that power dynamic. And so our systems aren't prepared for that power dynamic that we're experiencing.
Perhaps another reason for that constitutional convention, huh?
Yeah.
Hey, Kristin, I have another question. I think it's been addressed. Cammie Lee, your question about the Electoral College, why have it if, the interstate compact, sort of renders it moot. And Chris answered that. Did that answer the question for you, Cammie, or would you like to enlarge on that too, Christian? If so, go ahead and unmute and let her know more particularly what you'd like to hear. Okay. You got your question answered, I'm going to assume. So, Data, you were sharing a graphic.
Yeah, we were talking about the historical precedent for how two parties always create this kind of conflict. And this is some recent history in the House of Representatives, but just this effect of the voting system creating two parties that then become sort of divided over time, more and more divided, until eventually a third hump comes up in the middle, and then it sort of rearranges, and then you have two more parties that sort of slowly. Anyway, this process, the reason the founders knew about it is because it happens every single time you use plurality voting. It's been around for the history of humanity, right? Plurality voting has existed since pre-dawn, and they knew that. They see that in other places. This country has gone through this process multiple times. We've had shifts. Lincoln was a third party elected person because the two parties had become so diverse that that third party won. But all it does is shift the system And then a new paradigm is created, which slowly gets worse over time, right? So, and we had another shift in around the 1930s and 40s. There was a bit of a shift, and it might happen again. But the only way you're going to solve the long-term problem of the two-party system is getting rid of that Duverger's law outcome, getting rid of plurality voting.
Yeah, I think that is essential, and I think most of us would agree. I think we've, if anybody else has a question that they haven't posted it here, go ahead and unmute your mic. I think at this point, and we maybe have we had another minute. You could ask Kristin. If not, I did want to mention Joan Reinerson mentioned that the RCV, there's so much going on these days, and I wanted to endorse this because I do it too. And she mentioned setting up, say, a Google alert that would get you information that way. Now, of course, there's multiple ways through Fairvote to get all kinds of information on it, whether it's our website or, social media or a YouTube channel. And some people have asked also regarding that recording that we're making today. I'm anticipating we'll have that on the YouTube channel and or, a link on the site. Now, certainly post it in the Kitsap chapter social media. So if we, the other thing I wanted to ask about, anybody, I'm assuming no more questions at this point, so I haven't seen anybody post. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming. If you're so inclined, you've seen how much Kristin offers as far as this presentation today, and her book is available via Amazon, ebook or paperback, I think. Kristin, was there any way to buy through you or Sightline that you wanted to mention? If so, go ahead.
Yeah, so if you go to becomingademocracy.com, that'll give you a link to Book Baby, which is we self-published it through them, so you can buy it.
Oh, excellent. I did not know that. Okay, that was becomingademocracy.com?
Yep.
Okay,
and there's also an audiobook coming soon.
Ooh.
It's all recorded, and Amazon is checking the audio quality, so hopefully soon.
Okay. And this is on to housekeeping a little bit, but I did want to mention, because I don't always remember to, that we'll be meeting again in February, later in the month. Data and I are going to make sure we set the date next week. We're looking at either Saturday again, same time, 1 p.m., virtual as always, but it would be either the 20th or the 27th of February if you want to, mark those on your calendars. But we're going to have that set by next week, so we'll let you know with plenty of advance. Okay. Okay, Kristin, I can't express how grateful we are that you took the time to be with us today, and away from your family and everything else you have on your to-do list. So thanks very much. If there's any last thoughts, questions, anything for the good of the order, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you, everyone. And if you do have any follow-up questions, you can always email me, Kristin at Sightline.
Okay, Kristin at Sightline. Thank you. Thanks very much, Kristin.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.